By the time Harry Potter sets foot in Hogwarts in the first book film, the First Wizarding War is already a thing of the past. And at the same time, the Second Wizarding War is beginning to take shape, the primary focus of the books and films. But what I've always found interesting is that despite its scale and destruction, the First Wizarding War is typically treated as little more than distant history. The Second Wizarding War wasn't great either. There were a lot of lives lost, and for a while, it looked as though Voldemort might genuinely take control of the wizarding world for good. But compared with the First War, a truly catastrophic period in wizarding history that lasted a whopping 11 years, it was nothing. The First War started for reasons similar to the Second, when Voldemort, obsessed with pure-blood supremacy, sought to overthrow the existing magical order and establish himself as ruler. It began in 1970 and officially ended in October of 1981, when Voldemort's curse on Harry backfired and defeated him, at least temporarily. But despite being more or less glossed over in the books, the aftermath of this decade-long conflict left deep scars on the wizarding world that aren't ever really focused on, at least not in much detail. Entire families were torn apart, and many prominent witches and wizards lost their lives. And the uncertainty and sheer state of terror associated with the war can best be summarized by the following quote. "Imagine that Voldemort's powerful now. You don't know who his supporters are. You don't know who's working for him and who isn't. You know he can control people so that they do terrible things without being able to stop themselves. You're scared for yourself and your family and your friends. Every week, news comes of more deaths, more disappearances, more torturing. The Ministry of Magic's in disarray. They don't know what to do. They're trying to keep everything hidden from the Muggles. But meanwhile, Muggles are dying too. Terror everywhere. Panic, confusion. That's how it used to be." And today I want to take a closer look at the First Wizarding War. Not just how it began or what transpired, but specifically at the damage it caused and the families it broke. Let's dive into it. When you begin to examine the First Wizarding War more closely, the first thing that becomes clear is how difficult it is to pin down exact numbers. There isn't a definitive list of casualties, and the books don't give us a total. And even within the material we do have, a lot of information is fragmented. Some deaths are described in detail, but a lot of them are just sort of implied through context. Some people are confirmed to have been killed, while others just went missing. And in a number of cases, the only indication we have that someone died is a passing reference to a family being wiped out or lost. Another important point here is who was being targeted, as there were clear patterns in terms of who Voldemort and his supporters went after. Members of the Order of the Phoenix were obvious targets, as was anyone openly opposing him. But beyond that, sometimes entire families themselves became targets, particularly those with known allegiances or connections within circles of the good guys. And once a family was targeted, the damage rarely stopped at a single individual, which is exactly where the idea of families dying out starts to come into play. When people think about a family being wiped out, they tend to imagine a single catastrophic event. But during the First Wizarding War, it was often more gradual than that. A series of targeted attacks, disappearances, and killings that, over the course of 11 years, slowly stripped families down. Another factor here is the size of the wizarding population. Wizarding Britain isn't particularly large. Most wizards and witches are connected in some way, through Hogwarts, through work at the Ministry, or through family ties. So when individuals are lost, those losses don't stay isolated. They ripple outward, affecting extended family, friends, and entire social circles. And that's part of what gives the First Wizarding War its weight. The same names, the same families, the same networks kept coming up again and again, and over time, that started to change the structure of the community. By the time the war finally came to an end in 1981, the impact wasn't just measured in how many people died. It was also visible in what was left behind, with smaller families, missing generations, and gaps in places where there used to be continuity. And with that context in mind, let's take a closer look at the specific witches and wizards who were lost during the First Wizarding War. The Mckinnon family. The Mckinnon family is one of the few cases where the outcome is stated clearly. The entire family was killed during the First Wizarding War. The only named member in canon is Marlene Mckinnon, a member of the original Order of the Phoenix. In an early unpublished draft of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Rowling does mention some additional Mckinnons, like Angus and Elspeth, but they don't carry over into the final text. The deaths of the Mckinnons are referenced a few times, once by Hagrid and another by Moody, who notes that they were all killed, confirming that this wasn't an individual casualty, but the loss of an entire household. No one ever lived after he decided to kill them, no one except you, and he killed some of the best witches and wizards of the age, the Mckinnons. That's Molly Mckinnon. She was killed 2 weeks after this was taken. They got a whole family. We know from later testimony that Death Eaters were directly involved in attacks on Order members, and in this specific instance, it turned out that Travers was at least partially responsible. Yes, said Karkaroff, there was Travers. He helped murder the Mckinnons. The timing of their deaths is also relevant, as the Mckinnons are stated to have been killed toward the end of the war, during a period when violence had intensified and Voldemort's forces were operating more openly and more aggressively. Interestingly, there is actually a historical link between the Mckinnon and Potter families through marriage in an earlier generation, placing them within the same extended lineage. And while the connection was pretty distant, it does reinforce just how closely tied many of these families were. Like I mentioned earlier, no surviving members of the Mckinnon family are mentioned in canon after the war, and in terms of outcomes, this places them in a small category of families who were completely eradicated. The Bones family. The Bones family is another major example of a family that suffered heavily during the First Wizarding War. The main figure here is Edgar Bones, a member of the original Order of the Phoenix. He was the brother of Amelia Bones, who later became head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and the uncle of Susan Bones, the Hufflepuff student in Harry's year. Edgar is described as a great wizard, and like many members of the Order, he was eventually targeted by Voldemort's followers. His death is mentioned by Moody when he shows Harry the old photograph of the original Order. He and his family were murdered by Death Eaters. He was a great wizard. Edgar wasn't the only casualty, as his wife and children were killed along with him, wiping out an entire branch of the Bones family in one fell swoop. So by the time Harry's at Hogwarts, Susan isn't just another student in his year. She's one of the younger members of a family that had already been devastated by Voldemort's first rise to power. She also later tells Harry that her grandparents, her Uncle Edgar, his wife, and his children were all murdered. The Bones family may not have been completely erased like the Mckinnons appear to have been, but they were still hit extremely hard, and later on his sister Amelia would become another casualty of Voldemort's return. The Prewett family. The Prewett family is another clear example of a family that suffered major losses during the First Wizarding War. The key figures here are Fabian Prewett and Gideon Prewett, both members of the original Order of the Phoenix, and perhaps most relevant to the average Harry Potter fan, the brothers of Molly Weasley, meaning the Prewetts are Molly's maiden family. The Prewetts were also a pure-blood family, counted among the Sacred 28, and were connected to other major wizarding families, including the Blacks. Their deaths are referenced by Moody when he shows Harry the photograph of the original Order, and while we aren't given any detail about how they died, it is revealed that it took 5 Death Eaters to get the job done. Gideon Prewett. It took 5 Death Eaters to kill him and his brother Fabian. They fought like heroes. It's also later revealed that Antonin Dolohov had a part to play in their deaths. Antonin Dolohov, read the legend, beneath a wizard with a long, pale, twisted face who was sneering up at Harry, convicted of the brutal murders of Gideon and Fabian Prewett. Fabian and Gideon were powerful wizards, experienced fighters, and actively involved in resisting Voldemort. But even then, they were overwhelmed. Fred and George Weasley shared the same first initials as Fabian and Gideon, and it's often interpreted as Molly naming them in memory of her brothers. By the time the war ends, the Prewett family hasn't disappeared, but it has changed. The male line is generally considered to have ended with Fabian and Gideon, with the family continuing through Molly and the Weasleys instead. So while the name lives on indirectly, 2 central members of the family, both from the same generation, both part of the Order, are gone by the time the main story begins. The Potter family. The Potter family is one of the most well-known casualties of the First Wizarding War, but when placed alongside the others, their deaths follow the same broader pattern. The key figures here are James Potter and Lily Potter, Harry's parents and both members of the original Order of the Phoenix. Like many of the individuals we've already covered, they were actively opposing Voldemort. That alone made them targets. However, in their case, the situation becomes more specific. Due to a part of a prophecy made by Sybil Trelawney, Voldemort identified the Potter's son as a potential threat, which led directly to the decision to target the family. By this point, the Potters were already in hiding under the Fidelius charm, with Peter Pettigrew acting as secret keeper. But after Peter betrayed them, exposing their location, Voldemort acted swiftly. And on October 31st, 1981, Voldemort located the Potters and killed both James and Lily. By the time of their deaths, the Potter family was already small, reduced to just the three of them. And after that night, only one remained: the Longbottoms. The Longbottom family presents a slightly different case. Unlike the other families we've covered so far, this isn't a situation where the victims were killed, but the outcome is arguably just as severe. The key figures here are Frank Longbottom and Alice Longbottom, both Aurors and members of the original Order of the Phoenix. Like others in the Order, they were actively involved in resisting Voldemort during the war. However, what happened to them takes place after Voldemort's defeat in 1981, during a period when people believed the war was effectively over. Frank and Alice were captured by a group of Death Eaters: Bellatrix Lestrange, Rodolphus Lestrange, Rabastan Lestrange, and Barty Crouch Jr., who believed they had information about Voldemort's whereabouts. And they used the Cruciatus Curse on them repeatedly. Not once, not briefly, but continuously, to the point where the damage became permanent. The result wasn't death, but it was complete psychological destruction. Both Frank and Alice were left permanently incapacitated, unable to recognize their own son, and were moved to the Janus Thickey ward at St. Mungo's Hospital, where they remained for the rest of their lives. Because of this, Neville Longbottom grew up with his parents still alive, but completely gone in every other sense. And the state of his parents is actually a key part of his character development, as he struggles with the trauma of their condition and the pressure of living up to their legacy. He did end up being raised by his grandmother, Augusta Longbottom, and regularly visits them at St. Mungo's, where his mother gives him chewing gum wrappers, one of the few remaining signs of recognition. But while the Longbottom family wasn't wiped out, it was effectively broken. One of the clearest examples of how the effects of the First Wizarding War extended beyond its official end. While I focus mainly on families so far, there are a number of other individuals beyond the families we've covered. One of these is Dorcas Meadows. She's mentioned briefly, but with one key detail: she was killed personally by Lord Voldemort. That's not something we hear often. Most deaths are attributed to Death Eaters more generally, so when Voldemort himself is mentioned, it usually indicates that the individual was considered a significant threat. Another example is Benji Fenwick. His death is described in very direct terms. He was blown to bits. There's no additional context, but it gives a sense of the kind of violence involved. Then there's Caradoc Dearborn. He disappears during the war and is never found, presumed dead but never confirmed. And that's important because it reflects something we've touched on already. Not every death during the war was clearly recorded. Some people were killed and others simply vanished. There are also cases tied more loosely to the Order but still connected to the war. One example is Regulus Black, the younger brother of Sirius Black. Regulus initially supported Voldemort and became a Death Eater, but later turned against him after discovering the truth about the Horcruxes. He attempted to destroy one and was killed in the process, dragged underwater and drowned by Inferi in a truly gruesome end. And by the end of the war, the impact on the Black family is clear. Regulus is dead, Sirius is imprisoned, and while the family isn't wiped out, it's already in decline by the time the main story begins. And taken together, these cases fill in some of the gaps. Another thing I want to mention are the countless Muggle lives that were lost. For the most part, they did a pretty good job during the Second Wizarding War of keeping the Death Eaters out of Muggle communities. Not perfect, but decent. In the First Wizarding War, however, there were a lot more Muggle casualties, and a lot more cleanup. Many of these specific incidents are not mentioned in the books, but perhaps one of the best examples of Muggles being killed en masse is when Peter Pettigrew attempts to frame Sirius Black for the murder of the Potters, producing a curse that murdered 12 people, destroyed hundreds of feet of sewer system, and left a 40-foot crater in the ground. And while I'm going to end the video here, I'm honestly not even sure I've scratched the surface of how horrible that war really was. I guess that's one of the reasons Harry became so popular, as he was able to give a world hope that otherwise had none. And that's it for today's video. If you enjoy the content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, remember, it does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live.